It is I, Eamon,
I'm Reed.
and this is the first episode of Left Opposition. Reed, why have we entitled this podcast Left Opposition?
I think there's a few reasons. It's kind of a play on words in a way. Kind of most immediate meaning, I think, is that we are trying to kind of provide an opposing perspective on the left that goes against the sort of mainstream of contemporary leftist politics that sort of goes against the grain, but from a left wing perspective, really kind of grounded in historical leftist politics. There's a sense in which we want to be kind of critics of the existing left, but from a kind of more grounded historical leftist position. But it's also a kind of reference to the left opposition in the communist movement of the 1920s and 30s, out of which historical Trotskyism came. To my mind, I like that reference because both, Eamon and I are influenced by Trotskyism to various extents. But there's a sense in which Trotskyism as a politics is not adequate or not satisfactory. So I think for me, the left opposition represents this kind of last moment in which there was a kind of possibility for the old socialist movement that developed in the mid 19th century before its kind of final collapse and sort of self destruction. And, we can't really go back to that moment, but I think there's something of the ethos of pulling the emergency brake on the catastrophe that was happening. Again, we can't relive that moment, but maybe there's a sense in which we can try to see that catastrophe that did occur, the kind of destruction of the old socialist movement and the consequences of that over the 20th century. Maybe that isn't the end of the story with socialist politics, leftist politics. From my own perspective, there's a kind of digging out from under the rubble that needs to kind of go on. And so the spirit of the old left opposition is kind of important to me in that respect because there was a kind of awareness of a crisis at that moment that needs to kind of be rediscovered, I think, as opposed to just taking what resulted from that crisis as the be all end all. Go
And
ahead.
speaking of which, that we should point out that after doing some research and after kind of settling on the name, we did find out that there is another, indeed, Trotskyist podcast called The Left Opposition. But I listened to a few of their episodes, and to me, they're doing exactly what Reed is just mentioned there. They're not really adding anything, and they seem to be stuck in the 1940s. It's a bit of identity politics as well. They're not adding anything to the conversation, they're not helping us go back to a more fundamental and radical instantiation of Marxism. We are kind of stealing their name, but in fairness, we did come up with it before we knew they existed. I think we should take this opportunity to talk about who we are since we are starting this podcast. This is episode one, so we might as well give a little bit of an introduction to who we are and how we came to this place on the left.
Hmm.
So, Reed, why don't you start?
I mean, I've been interested in, I guess, left politics, specifically Marxism, for pretty much my whole adult life. And it's always been really more of an intellectual concern of mine than a political one. Like, I wouldn't say that I was really initially motivated so much by like a political conviction that Marxism gave some sort of substance to, um, I think there's, and not that there's anything wrong with this, but I think there is a tendency to sort of have a kind of rebellious attitude towards the status quo of some kind, or alternatively, or maybe in conjunction with that, a kind of moral sense of something wrong that needs to be righted, of some kind of uh, you know some kind of political, um, malignant political tendency in that in power that needs to be opposed
Right.
in a kind of righteous manner. And that wasn't exactly like kind of what got me into. And then Marxism being one way of sort of rationalizing those sentiments. And again, I don't think that's wrong. I don't think getting into things that way is wrong necessarily. But I took a kind of a different approach. I kind of was back when I was like a teenager. I was reading like philosophy. It kind of grabbed my attention, and it was in that context that I was kind of introduced to Marx as well, for one thing, as a kind of a follower of Hegel and Kant and like the German idealist tradition, but also in a sense, Marx represented kind of a step beyond philosophy in a way, but one that's sort of rooted in that tradition. And so, what interested in me about Hegel in particular, and then Marx as a consequence of that, was this idea that there was a kind of coherent, rational um, development to history that you could make sense of, and that you could comprehend, and that it had a kind of a direction and a necessary trajectory. And not that that was sort of laid out in advance like a kind of a fate, but that in a sense the culminating consequence of this whole course of development was the development of like freedom, of human freedom in society. And so, you know, Marxism is sort of taking up a kind of perspective like that from Hegel, but in a moment of crisis. So the kind of modern bourgeois world that Hegel, for example, was giving a kind of an intellectual reflection to in the course of its emergence, came into crisis in the early 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And we've been kind of living with that crisis ever since. And Marxism was an attempt to kind of theoretically clarify what exactly was going wrong in that moment and what potential there was in that crisis to go beyond it. And for Marx, that potential was embodied in the working class movement, the organization of the working class, as an independent political force. Um, and so, there's a lot more to be said about that, but that sort of intrigued me from a pretty young age, and I had maybe a more rudimentary understanding of it for most of that time. But I went through different, as a kind of I kind of realized that there are kind of political implications to this, and when I was young, I definitely felt, I grew up in a kind of a middle class sort of house. I mean, you know, not not like upper middle class, but not like lower middle class. Pretty comfortable, but not affluent exactly. And I definitely had a sense that there was kind of something wrong in the world. Like things weren't exactly the way they should be. Like there was something kind of irrational in the way the world worked. And the older I got, the kind of more of a sense I got of that. But it was only out of that desire to kind of understand things, to understand why things were the way they were, that I eventually started kind of realizing that there might be political implications, like political necessities, something that might need to change, something that might need to be done. And so, I spent like most of my, kind of young adult life trying to make sense of that. And, tarrying with like the left wing politics as it was developing in the early 2000s was kind of confusing. Like it didn't really cohere with uh, like Marx's like theoretical work, which is what I was kind of familiar with. And the more I learned about like the history of Marxist politics, of communism, socialism, communism, all that, the more confused I kind of got. And eventually I ended up encountering and joining the Platypus Affiliated Society, which sort of gave me, I would say, like a much more adequate education in why the left of the present is the way it is, how it got to that point, and what that has to do with historical Marxism. Um, so that's kind of how I got to where I am now. But Platypus is really an educational project, and and it's specifically kind of a critical or a kind of a negative educational project that's kind of concerned with diagnosing or kind of demonstrating, kind of presenting what's wrong with the left. And um, I have gotten kind of to the point where I'm a little bit more interested in trying to flesh out like what positively can we learn from the old historical socialist movement of Marx's time, and immediately after, and um like what lessons might that have for the present and for the future in terms of political possibilities for the present and the future. So that's kind of where I'm at. And like I'm interested in criticizing the existing left, not so much like, you know, harping on it, but in the sense of like there are lessons from our own, from this history that we claim, that we're whose legacy we're claiming to take up, that we should take much more seriously than we do. So I think maybe that's like kind of a main topic of discussion that we'll probably be kind of dealing with on this show. But yeah, what about you, Eamon? What was your kind of background on the left, and how'd
So
you get stuff?
I came from kind of a working class background, but we I had family on my mother's side that were more middle class. And but my dad was like a union guy. He would in his past, before we were born, he had been pushed to I think he was a union leader at one point.
Mhm.
Um and he had been pushed to run as an NDP candidate in I think 1990 or 1992, when the
Mhm.
Bob Rae government in Ontario swept into power for the first time ever. The New Democrats, are the left wing,
Right.
uh, ostensibly socialist, at least when they started, or social democrat party in Canada. And yeah, so he almost, if he had taken up that he would have been a sitting MPP, member of parliament in Ontario for a bit. But anyway, so he had been a Trotskyist growing up. He was
Mm.
part of I think it might have been Socialist Action in
Mhm.
Canada, which is kind of a Trotskyist sect, but they were big in like the 60s and 70s, or bigger,
Mhm.
I should say. And some of his friends were in that as well. And but I think uh, most of his friends and himself, he kind of over time left the Trotskyism behind and became more of a standard social democrat.
Uh,
Like, you know, he was very news and newspaper type guy. So I learned a lot through him. And he when Obama won, he was happy. When uh not that he thought this was the best option possible, but like, so cheering for Democrats over Republicans, and left wing guys, or even having the liberals beat the conservatives in Canada, was kind of a win from his perspective. He had kind of
mm.
um, fallen into that a bit, and so I also learned a bit of the Russian history and Trotskyism from my dad as early as like grade 8. I think he started telling me about it, and that captured my attention. And the stories of Cuba and Che Guevara and Castro, and I read the Communist Manifesto in my teens, and that's kind of set me up sort of for success, because I knew I was a socialist, but and that if I was going to go anyway, it was going to be Trotskyism over Stalinism. Um, and then through university, I went. I took a lot of I took politics. There wasn't much Marx. There was lots of like units. Every class I took had like a Marxist unit, where like,
Uh-huh.
here's the class dynamic of this issue of immigration, or U.S. politics, or whatever the hell it was, or feminism, women's issues. And yeah, so like Marx was like one. It was kind of the intersectional approach. Like class dynamics were one
Uh-huh.
way of looking at things among many. And
Right,
it
right.
wasn't until I took a class called capitalism in my fourth or fifth year of university that I actually got to really dig into Marx. We read
Mhm.
Capital, we read Adam Smith, we read Ricardo,
Oh, wow.
we read Weber, um, and yeah, and lots of good stuff in there, and that kind of really opened my eyes. I'm like, oh, okay, this is serious. Like, I don't have to be just a a Keynesian or like go fight for Fordism again. It's like actually
Mhm.
no, this is this is the real deal.
Mhm.
And so then I was kind of floating around looking for socialist Marxist outlets for a long time. I probably considered myself like a social, no, a democratic socialist for a long time. I
Uh,
found Jacobin, um, and I was basically alone in Kingston. I think I called up the ISO at one point when they were still around because I noticed they were doing something in Toronto, and I was like, I had a conversation with one of their leaders and started getting their mail, but then they kicked me out
oh
because
yeah,
they very over some like comments. They were like, oh god, they were like basically backing. I don't know. It wasn't Hamas, but it was like it was something promoting like Islamists as freedom fighters or something like
right.
that. I'm like, God, this doesn't sound right to me. And to be fair, I was kind of in a midst of also one of these new atheist phase. So I
Oh
was
okay.
listening to too much Hitchens and Sam Harris. So I probably thought Islam was a little bit worse than the others. Um, but
Well, certainly, like in that extreme form, it can be, I
yeah,
mean, any religion, if it becomes like extremely violently reactionary, it can be certainly off-putting. But go ahead.
but
I'm sorry.
Hitchens actually helped me kind of improve my Marxism because as I really got into Hitchens and like I loved his debates, fighting,
Yeah.
not fighting, but debating his the um, the religious people he debated for a while. But then I noticed that he was also had historical debates
Yeah.
on. He had lots of talks on socialism and politics.
Mhm.
And if you go back far enough, he has some great ones where he's really getting into the Marxism and the Trotskyism. Um, I read his book too. Anyway, and then eventually I figured out that one of my childhood friends was he was an Orthodox Trot, a Grantite in the IMT, and they were hosting a big get together, a big Marxist university, and
Mhm.
so I was like, well, I'll just go. And it was in Montreal, so I showed up, and I was like, a bunch of lectures they gave or talks they gave, and I was like, yep, this sounds right. You guys, they were criticizing intersectionality and post-colonial theory and identity politics. I was like, okay, these are the right Marxists for me. This is where I want to go. And by
Mhm.
that point, I had already started my YouTube channel, and I had already kind of got into like YouTube Marx and reading a little bit on my own here and there in the kind of sporadic way a lot of people did at that time,
Mhm.
not guided in any way. And so I had kind of a Marxist YouTube channel, um, and it really wasn't that Marxist to be honest, but but I had already actually used one of their articles before meeting the IMT as the basis for one of my videos. It was their critique on intersectionality. So anyway,
Mhm.
I joined them. I was with them for 3 years. I was an Orthodox Trot. I learned a lot. Um, I liked that they forced you to get out of your shell, go set up a table somewhere, talk to
Yeah.
people.
Mhm.
So that part was cool. A lot of what we did was cringe, or like going out with chanting in the streets with like groups of like four people. It's
Oh yeah,
got a
I'd
lot of
done
silly stuff,
I'd
but
done a few of those things too in my
yeah,
day.
a lot of it was kind of silly. But but they would encourage you to like have something prepared and go if you're going to a demonstration and go say something and like recruit people and give the Marxist perspective of why anti-racism isn't going to solve the problems for this Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
issue right now, blah blah blah. And so and then their education isn't terrible. It's pretty good. Like because I started at the beginning of COVID, I got a whole ton of reading done all in the first like 3-4 months, just
Mhm.
back to back to back. I was a great student for that period, especially. And then you get into some of the more advanced texts. But I ended up accumulating quite a few problems with the organization.
Mm.
I ended up making a list, and I wasn't kicked out of the organization by the end, but
Mhm.
the EC was quite annoyed with my behavior because I
Yeah.
was kind of having this like break where like the organization was saying these things, and I was like, well, some of this is bullshit, and like I was kind of acting out, let's say,
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
social media, and they were not fans of that. And so I'll just list some of the things that were not I was not a fan of. I thought they were
Yeah.
too insular, because at this time I had uh, been listening to a lot of Derek Varn and Sublation and Doug Lane and Platypus. I got into Platypus,
Mm-hmm.
and they were doing all these panels with different, people from different sects and different trends
Yeah.
on leftism. But I noticed, like, you didn't get a good education on the history of the left, or where all this came from and why all these other organizations exist. They didn't really tell you much about that.
I
And
think
so I thought,
each sect has their own story that
sort of, yeah,
leaves a lot out,
they
and
leave
they only
exactly.
really teach you their side of it, you know? But
Exactly. And so I
yeah,
thought it was too insular. Um, they did for things like Mayday, they would reach out to other things, but like other organizations. That's the only time you get, if you remember, that's the only time you would even notice that other organizations existed or other
yeah,
tendencies existed.
right.
Other than the Stalinists, as a general thing that you were opposing.
Hmm.
So yeah, they were too insular, not much engagement with the rest of the left. I thought that was weird. I wrote at the time, this was a few years ago, that they were too Catholic. Now I go to Catholic church every week now, so man, I might not say that anymore, but maybe just too sectarian. Maybe that's what that means. Like, there's approved texts they want you to read, right?
Interesting.
And
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
they'll tell you should read other things too, but like, if it sounds like you're going too far in other directions, they're like, stick to these texts, right?
Mm.
We have the ones that we think are the best. And to be fair, a
Like
lot of them are great.
dogmatic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
a lot of them
Mhm.
are great, but like, they want you kind of in the specific box, so you're not kind of asking questions outside
Mm.
of what they're thinking.
Hmm.
And then you kind of go over a lot of the same introductory texts over and over and over and over. And which has its benefits, but again, if they're teaching it in the same way every time,
Hmm.
it's not that illuminating. Although there were more advanced texts that I got into as well. Now this, you probably disagree with me here, but I think there's some that I don't know about validity, but some merit to looking into PMC theory. You may disagree with me there. We can talk about
No,
that
no, I
episode.
don't. I mean, depends on what you mean. I mean, I think there's definitely some truth in it, but I
Right.
think overall, especially the way, I mean, even when it was formulated by the Ehrenreichs in the 70s, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but especially the way it gets talked about now, I think there's a great deal of confusion that attaches to that concept.
Right.
But it's not like it's completely without merit. I think it's an
Right. Yeah.
expression of a kind of moment of confusion and an attempt to kind of grapple with a confusing moment in history, and a confusing convergence of phenomena. And I think there is something to it, but I definitely have issues with some of the kind of formulations of it. But go on.
But the Trots wouldn't. You couldn't bring up that there might be different stratas among the working class that may have different.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Okay.
yeah, they were just like, oh no, that's just petty bourgeois. They didn't couldn't consider this concept,
Hmm.
which to
Hmm.
me at the time I was getting into.
Yeah.
Gender ideology, obviously, this was a big one for me. Like,
Yeah.
especially, at first I was kind of all on board with the stuff in like 2018, 2017. And then the more I
Mm,
thought
yeah.
about it, and the more I realized I was being lied to about specific things. I'm like, wait a minute, I went into a rabbit hole and almost turned out everything was a lie.
Yeah.
And the logic was just bad. It was never there.
Mhm.
The theory behind it. And the organization, took a few stances. They were, basically pro gender affirming care. They
Mhm.
thought it should be supplied to everybody for free. They thought, it was wrong for schools to, no, they thought it was right for schools to ban, to not tell parents if they were socially transitioning their kids at school. They thought, that the parents were the site of um, this child's distress, and
Mhm.
they should be separated, by the state, basically, which I did not agree with. Their take on the American Revolution was a typical kind of progressive take, which I, with a Marxist flair, obviously, but my James and I went over that as well. I didn't agree with that. The lockdown and safetyism, I did not. They were very much like, you know, they were pro lockdown. Basically, they were saying, "Oh, this is it's the government is trying to keep things open, and it's dangerous for workers." And they were, very pro masking and a lot of things that didn't have a lot of evidence. Well, I mean, the lockdowns themselves and social distancing didn't have a whole lot of evidence, and they were just kind of going along with this the safetyism culture.
They didn't take some. I know some leftists took a line along the lines of uh, like the lockdowns are like a road to socialism or something. Like the state will have to take over the economy because of the crisis or something, and
they
that
may
could be
have
a yeah that
they may
that
have
kind of thing is
flirted
quite
with that, but
off
I
the
don't.
rails.
I don't
But
think that was quite their line.
okay,
But
well that's a little bit more sensible at least. But yeah, I take your point. You know that is definitely yeah, I can see why you'd be a little bit disgruntled about that for sure.
yeah, yeah, Grossman's theory I was really into for a while with Ted Reese, and they
Mhm.
had no time for that idea that
Mhm.
capitalism might break down in some way, which is fine. I mean, that's debatable. Again, MMT. This is somewhere where we agree. We disagree on.
Mhm.
I do think that there is some merit to what MMT says about how the economy actually works, how macroeconomic operations work today.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, they had a critique of it, but it was kind of a weak critique. And that was kind of my
Mhm.
main, it was a lazy critique, I should say.
Mhm.
They said multiple times that, it was stupid to talk about 9/11 as an inside job. We might disagree about this too, but I think it's pretty obvious, especially now. Um, and that it shouldn't be dismissed. It should at least be like open. And I think there's imperialist reasons for that. Obviously, there's Marxist reasons. You might explain that. Estranged, yeah, they didn't think much of estranged labor or alienation. They didn't want to talk about that much.
Mhm.
Um, and oh yeah, the false optimism. Really, that was the biggest one. The
Yeah.
they're all revolutions around the corner. Conditions have never been more ripe, and that really started to gnaw at me. And yeah,
Yeah.
eventually we
I can see that, you know.
yeah, uh, and they're just like they're recruiting exclusively from students, but doing it in a way that was, I think, recruiting the kind of wrong kind of students.
Mm.
They would have these critiques of identity politics and intersectionality and queer theory and all this stuff, and yet the way they presented themselves was like an invitation. It was inviting those type of people in, and we ended up having like lots of problems because those people who were still had those ideas in their heads were becoming Marxists, but they're it was watering down, I think, the whole organization. Anyway, I got out of there after 3 years, and and I don't know what I've been doing since then, but yeah, the more and more I've been um, getting into kind of the classical Marxism. I've
Mhm.
taken one of Chris Catrone's courses. I haven't joined Platypus, but I think I intend to at some point when I have
Mm.
time. Um, but yeah, and so now I think I agree with you. Now I'm at a point where really the left needs to be opposed. The left as it is today needs to be opposed,
Mhm.
and in an intellectual way. But I mean, I do think what Sublation's doing and what the campaign for a socialist party is doing are they're good things too. I don't have the time. I have a baby now. I don't have the time to be an activist. I don't think.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think getting just the battle of ideas here on the internet is going to be worthwhile enough.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I feel that, you know, and I think in terms of opposing the left, like what I mean by that, is not like um I just that your whole recounting of the experience with the IMT, I think is just so interesting because um it's very much kind of exemplary of a kind of what I would call like a sectarian, approach
Mhm.
to left politics, which is not really political at all, but a sort of dissolving of of politics into a kind of religious or quasi-religious, sort of community of like-minded people, essentially with their own, characteristic ideas and practices and what have you. But I think like when and I should say I'm a member of Platypus. We've talked about Platypus a little bit, but this is sort of a separate kind of thing from all of that. Platypus has a very specific kind of orientation in terms of its activity. It's very, very interested in giving, I think, students interested in left politics a very different kind of education in the left than the one you described. In terms of like what you got from the IMT.
Mhm.
Um, there is, for example, and just I figure it might be worth mentioning, in Platypus, there is a kind of like reading list. There are kinds of canonical texts that are kind of rehearsed over and over. But they aren't like, that isn't for the sake of like, this is the dogma that you need to internalize and agree with. It's rather like directed at like, these are the texts you need, at a minimum to kind of be able to engage with the various tendencies out there on the left and be able to kind of get a grip on where they're coming from and why they have the perspective they have, and like where it might be kind of weak or incoherent or self-contradictory, in order to kind of interrogate why the left is that way. So it's less about like, this is the truth, you need to understand this is the truth and accept it, and rather it's kind of equipping yourself to be able to kind of make sense of the left as it is. And from there, like, it's really more of a matter of drawing your own conclusions. It's about education in that kind of open-ended sense of like, not this is the truth that you must learn, but rather, um, these are the problems that are out there that we still need to kind of work through and make sense of. And there isn't really a clear solution to those problems at the present. And I think the kind of sectarian approach, even when it doesn't take the form of like a sectarian organization per se, but I think you can see this even in the more kind of mainstream general leftist mentality. There is a very kind of like insistence on like, this is right, this is wrong, you're good, this is good, this is bad.
Mhm.
Like, it's very black and white. It's very sort of authoritarian in that sense of like intolerant of ambiguity, intolerant of like complexities of in terms, or nuances and those sorts of things. And it's very much about like, this is there's a correct perspective that you should accept, and then there are all of these incorrect perspectives that you shouldn't accept. And the sectarian approach sort of insists upon a particular perspective to the exclusion of others in a way that really shuts down what's actually needed, which is, what is like the significance of this history in the present. I mean, it's not clear. We need to kind of work through this history and these ideas and sort of make sense of them, in a way that nobody clearly has worked it out at this point. Maybe Marxism is like no longer really meaningful as a political uh, you know,
Mm.
project going forward. Maybe it is. But the idea that like this group or this person or that person has like all the answers is just, I think, patently absurd. So like, I'm interested in education, in the in like in terms of like promoting these ideas and like helping people kind of get a grip on them, but not in the sense of like, I know all the answers, this is what you have to believe.
Mhm.
And I don't think there's any real merit in organizations that have that approach. Rather, like, I think what's needed is a kind of, I think people need to have a kind of sober, but sober and serious, but nonetheless kind of like curious sense of like trying to kind of think through the things that, like, you're saying, you had all of these various questions or maybe divergences, and it was just, there was a kind of intolerance
Yeah.
towards a lot of that, and an attempt to kind of shut it down. And that's like that's like deadly. That that is a surefire way of, because, and not just in terms of like trying to recruit people into an organization. I mean, you can have success in that sort of authoritarian manner of like insisting upon one
Yeah.
particular perspective up to a point. You may have to like loosen things at points, or tighten them at points. But I think a real political project, if there is one to be had, is going to have to tarry with like enormous masses of people that are mostly not going to agree on most things, and
Yeah.
to the extent that they do agree, it's going to have to be in a manner that like they're working it out as in terms of like working out the agreement as things unfold in social reality in the course of a very complex set of actions and organizations and conflicts and relationships. It's not like you just figure it out and then do it. It's much more like you need to engage with enormous masses of people that are that are not necessarily all going to agree on everything, that are not going to be all on the same page about everything. And so like for me, like one of the most interesting things about Marxism, and one of the reasons I think it still has a lot of relevance, is that it has a very, I think, kind of sophisticated approach to the role of ideas in social reality, where it's, I mean, there's a lot of heat generated, probably more heat than light, over like idealism versus materialism, for example. And there's various other, you know,
Yeah.
kinds of dichotomies that come up in this tradition. But to the extent that there's like a critique of idealism in Marxism, it's not like of a like a it's not like of like a theoretical position so much as like an approach to the role of ideas in social reality. So it's not like it's the point would be that like having the right idea is not sufficient to change the world, and the world isn't the way it is because people have this idea that things should be this way or something. That's not to say that ideas play no role in that process. They certainly do play a role, and ultimately they should play more of a role in a kind of emancipated society, like what people think would correspond more to the way things are ostensibly. They would be more free in that sense, that they'd be able to determine their own lives in a conscious manner. But at present, that's just not the way things are. At present, there's a great deal of like unconscious forces bearing upon us,
Hmm.
and our ideas are shaped by those unconscious forces in ways that we can't always sort of that aren't always kind of made explicit. And so it's much less a matter of like getting the right idea than it is about kind of engaging with social reality, and kind of recognizing the role that ideas and purveyors of ideas have in that social reality, as opposed to
Mm.
insisting upon or trying to force, like, we have the correct theory, we have the correct idea, you have to, so the point would be like, what are like kind of the tendencies at work in social reality that might lead towards a particular perspective on things, like, and not just in the sense of like, uh you know how could we persuade people that this idea is correct, like what might be the conditions of that. In a sense, Marxism kind of emerges at a point where certain ideas had already proven themselves in social reality to have a certain significance. Like these socialist ideas emerged before Marx and Engels, and they arrived on the scene at a point where there was already a kind of mass interest in these ideas that was sort of, a little strange in some respects. But so Marxism is in one respect a kind of theory of why socialism caught on as a kind of mass phenomenon, not
Hmm.
just among the working class, but especially among the newly emerging industrial working class in the 19th century. So I think in that respect, like, when we talk about opposing the left, it's not like we, in my sense of this, and I feel like you would probably agree, is that it's not like we have the right ideas and they have the wrong ideas and we need to oppose our ideas to their ideas or something like that. It's, for me, it's more like the left as it is presently is incoherent. It's like not real, like it's not really a political phenomenon, and to the extent that it does have any like political reality, it's like an appendage of the Democratic Party, or of
Yeah.
the analogs of the Democratic Party in other countries. And it doesn't really like constitute an independent political force for socialism or for anything for that matter. Like all these trappings of the historical left are like rhetorical or like aesthetic or something. And there is kind of like a lack of seriousness about the project of, like, say, Marxism, or more generally kind of like revolutionary politics in history. So, and that takes the form, to a large extent, going back to what we were saying at the very beginning, of a kind of fixation on the forms into which the old socialist movement kind of degenerated in the 20th century, into these kinds of, um, I would say, like, politically, like, unreal in a sense, or like, disconnected from reality in terms of their self-consciousness phenomena, like, so anyway, I may be rambling a bit, but my point is basically, like, I'm more interested in trying to, like, help leftists not feel like they need to be beholden to, like, the dogma, this or that dogma, as like the correct perspective, and instead to have, like, more of a kind of an open-minded perspective on this history. But not like open-minded in the sense of, like, you know just rejecting, the idea that anything, you know there's open-minded and there's open-minded, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's worth taking Marxism seriously on its own terms. So I don't mean open-minded in the sense of, like, rejecting that there could be something coherent there just out of hand, which I think can happen a lot of the time. Um, I don't mean open-minded in the sense of essentially just going with the flow, but nonetheless, I think, there is a sense in which the existing left is made up of people that have been, especially people of, like, our generation, but probably among the younger generation as well, um, who have been sort of sold a bill of goods, and just, this is what they know now, and they're just kind of adapted to it. And, like, I'm hoping that there are people that are more willing to kind of think, I want to say, like, think outside the box, in a
Mhm.
way, but I know that's kind of a cliche. But, I mean, I think that's important to do. I think it's worth taking, like, the kinds of questions that, for example, your experience in the IMT raised in your mind, taking those kinds of questions seriously and not just dismissing them out of hand because they're not Marxism. Like, you mentioned MMT, for example. Like,
Yeah.
I'm skeptical of that idea, of that theory, but I can understand why it's plausible, and I think it's worth taking seriously. And I wouldn't just dismiss it because it's not Marxism in my mind. But
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
One of the problems with the way they, the kind of dogmatic approach is, like, you notice in that organization is there were not a lot of bright lights. Let's put it that way. There were definitely some bright lights.
Mm,
You could tell there were people who were, like, well read outside of the Marxist texts.
right.
Then there was a whole layer of, like, secondary kind of leaders that were just, like, the only thing they were good at was knowing Marxism.
Mm,
Whereas, like, there were some people, when they talked, you could tell they understood the Bible, they understood physics, or history, or whatever. Like, they were well read, they were kind of jack of all trades outside of just these Marxist texts.
mm,
And you don't you saw a very low level of just general political understanding and
mm.
historical understanding among the vast majority of people there.
Yeah.
They just they gave you the sliver that you were going to learn. You're going to be really good at that. And it wasn't the type of place where you could see it attracting, like, the bright, well-educated people who might one day in a revolutionary movement move over and see the use of Marxist ideas. Couldn't see that in an organization like that because they were just so dogmatic, and so, like, they weren't
Mm,
open to anything but kind of lemmings, basically.
mhm, mhm.
So, like, people who could think for themselves weren't really, like, kind of invited into that perspective, and so
Yeah.
it was a bit stifling in that way. But um so why don't we take this opportunity to look at the mission statement,
Mm,
pseudo mission statement, and then
sure.
contrast that with and talk about, like, what this podcast is and what it isn't.
Sure. Yeah, so I wrote this thing a few years ago now, I guess. As just a sort of a I was putting this out there as kind of my own perspective, and what I feel like, you know, I'm like not interested in forming a group or organizing like a sectarian group or something like that.
Mhm.
But I am interested in like promoting a certain set of ideas from the historical left that I think get neglected or misunderstood or misconstrued. Um, and raising some history that I think has been forgotten or mischaracterized, that I think is very important and significant. And so this kind of explains like what that is and why I had those, my reasoning for that. And, I posted this on Twitter as just kind of a statement of like, this is my perspective. And if you're interested, I'd like to, you know, be in conversation with you about that, essentially. And Eamon, you kind of latched onto this and thought it was interesting and kind of worth taking up as maybe a sort of a yeah, like you said, a kind of a mission statement for this podcast. So I'm just going to read this. This is slightly revised from what I originally posted, but I have here. Let me move this here. So, I want to meet other socialists who take the task of building a socialist party in the US seriously. I think doing that would require a revival of the old socialist tradition embodied in the Socialist Party of America of Eugene Debs, the Debs era, which adapted the classical Marxism of Marx and Engels and their followers in the Second International to the distinctive conditions of the United States. The task is not to organize a sectarian organization that separates itself from the masses on the basis of its superior theoretical consciousness or political program, nor is the task to rally support for one of the parties of the ruling class. The task is to raise the possibility, the desirability, the necessity of the working class organizing itself into an independent political party as the means of taking power away from the ruling class and reestablishing the rule of the people, the revolutionary democratic republic. The Debsian tradition is indispensable for this purpose. The Socialist Party of America represented the revolutionary heritage of the United States, seeking to renew the American Revolution by overthrowing the industrial aristocracy and their tyrannical state, abolishing the last form of slavery, wage slavery, and restoring the democratic republic, thereby securing the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This can speak far more readily to the discontents of ordinary working class Americans and the political consciousness they already possess, however rudimentary it may presently be. Can speak far more readily to those discontents than, kind of the mainstream leftist perspective, I suppose. That appeal can be made through an appeal to the radicalism of the American revolutionary legacy that is their inheritance and that continues to inflect the general political consciousness of American society. There is immense explosive potential in this, but most avowed socialists have no interest in it or are positively hostile to it. I want to meet other socialists who recognize this potential to discuss how it might be brought to fruition. Rebuilding a mass socialist party in the United States would require educating and training a cadre of orators, writers, publishers, teachers, organizers, and candidates in the tradition of Debsian socialism. The Socialist Party of America was built up principally by sending speakers to continuously tour throughout the country, giving lectures and speeches, distributing literature, and organizing clubs for the study and propagation of these ideas. Those clubs, made up of people persuaded to take up the socialist cause, would then discuss and study and distribute that literature, and eventually produce their own, organizing more lectures, rallies, and other public meetings, train more speakers and send them into as yet unorganized areas, raise the funds necessary to support this activity, and when they'd grown significantly strong, conduct the same kind of activity under the auspices of electoral campaigns by standing candidates for as many offices as they could, using the vote to better gauge their influence and strength, to spread their message even more widely than they could otherwise, and to represent and preserve the political independence of the working class. This is, of course, not the only activity in which such a party, organized as such, or in the process of formation, must engage, but it is indispensable as a means to that end, the catalyst that can crystallize the tendencies towards class consciousness and organization among the masses of working people. Those who would like to revive the legacy of the old Socialist Party of America and the Second International Marxism from which it sprang would do well to study the publications and speeches of that era's propagandists, especially those of Eugene Debs, and to forget everything they've inherited from the century following the movement's collapse, save the negative lessons of what not to do. Socialist speakers and writers must spread the idea of the working class organizing itself into an independent political party as the means of taking power into its own hands, if that idea is ever to be given serious consideration by the people who must so organize themselves, and who might recognize their interest in doing so. They must thereby combat the corrosive influence of contemporary so called socialists who continue to drag the reputation of that once great name through the muck of the 20th century in faithful service to the Democratic Party. So I just wanted to say, after reading that, so that's, that obviously has a pretty, it has something of a perspective to it in terms of what I think is kind of the right course to be on. But the point I'm trying to make here is not like this is the thing that needs to happen, this is what everyone needs to agree with. I think people should consider it. I think people should consider this history, which I think has been sort of forgotten and distorted in light of what's happened in the century since then. But I think it's worth taking this seriously, in at least in terms of a kind of a very minimal idea of what we're even talking about when we're talking about Marxism. Really what we're talking about is the idea that the working class, the modern working class of wage laborers, um, should in a sense organize themselves into an independent political party and win political power in pursuit of their interests, their common interests as a class. And, there's a great deal of other stuff that gets kind of associated with Marxism for, rightly or wrongly. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be taken into consideration, but I think at the heart of the matter is that idea of the working class organizing itself around its common class interests and pursuing political power to that end. And everything else is kind of secondary in a sense to that. So it's not about like they're having this elaborate theoretical explanation of why the working class should do that or why they are doing that in the case of Marxist time. Necessarily, I mean, there are different reasons why you might think that that's the case. And there's different conceptions of what those common interests might be and what that might drive them to do, in terms of what is the platform of the party, what is the rhetoric of the party, et cetera. I mean, it's not a matter of like this is right and this is wrong. It's more of a matter of working out what it would even mean for the working class to organize itself as a class. And so, I think it's a much more of a kind of an open prospect of like um fleshing out this idea, trying to kind of get a grip on what it might mean, and not just in the minds of like a minority of overeducated intellectuals who have their own concerns, but in the sense of spreading this idea amongst the people to whom it's actually like addressed. So I think when I wrote this, something that was really kind of fresh in my mind was the experience of the previous going back to 2015, 2016, of this kind of insurgency in both the political parties in the United States, the Bernie Sanders kind of insurgency and the Trump insurgency. And, think whatever you want about either of them. But, there's one thing that I don't think you can deny, which is that in both cases, they represented their appeal represented, a widespread kind of discontent with the political status quo that maybe was not articulated explicitly working class terms, or at least, it was maybe in some ways to some extent, but, in any case, like regular, let's say working people, let's leave the class question out of it for a moment. you know, there was this kind of wave of frustration and just kind of exasperation with the ruling elites, with the whole political structure of the country, with the political parties, the bureaucracy, but also the big corporations, like all of it. And that expressed itself in different ways in both, the appeal of the Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign. And actually, so not as we're recording this, yesterday Trump met with Mamdani, Zoran
Yeah.
Mamdani, and that was quite an extreme. That was a very interesting meeting, in this connection that, Trump, who had been kind of condemning him as a communist, in the meeting after they had met, and we're doing a press conference afterwards, Trump is saying we actually agree on quite a lot, and actually, like, I like a lot of his ideas, and we share a lot of ideas, and maybe he'll change, but I've also changed, and all these kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying all this because I have any kind of like illusions in Trump or Mamdani for that matter, but they're both real phenomena in social reality, and they should be taken seriously on those terms. And I think in that respect, they and Sanders and some other things along these lines, and of course, there's all kinds of international examples you could point to as well,
Yep.
represent a kind of well of untapped potential among the working people for a kind of oppositional politics to the status quo, to the ruling class, that represents the interests of common working people. Now, Trump doesn't really reflect that in a kind of ultimately satisfying way, I think. And I think
Right.
it's obviously he doesn't always have traction. And, at the end of the day, is what he's doing going to like solve this problem? Of course not. Same could be said if Sanders became president, or Mamdani for that
I
matter.
feel like Trump picked the wrong vehicle. Some other kind of party, he might be able to actually do things quite a bit differently, but he's kind of boxed in by the Stephen Millers and the ghouls that he has in his team.
And,
Because
I
like,
think the same would be the case if like Sanders became president. I
yeah,
think he would be boxed in different ways.
yeah,
But I think like for me, what's more interesting than what they actually do or say or whatever is like kind of like the energy behind them in
yeah,
society, especially in terms of the campaigns, less so than the actual governing, the administration and so on. But, to some extent there too. I think, I'm more interested in like that appeal. How could that have manifested differently if there were if there was something else out there that isn't out there right now? you know like the left is not really making significant inroads amongst the working class, I think, for pretty obvious reasons, in terms of like the preoccupations of the mainstream left over the last decade, at least maybe two
hmm
decades. I mean, really it goes back much deeper than that.
hmm
But
yeah,
like someone like Sanders does make some inroads because, I think a lot of his appeal is not like the promising of this and that, you're going to get this and that. It's more of the opposition, I think. I think it's more of like,
yeah.
this is an FU to the status quo. And I think that's a big part of Trump's appeal as well. I think that's probably a big part of Mamdani's appeal in New York City amongst Trump voters, amongst, as well as Democratic voters. And so I think that kind of oppositional energy amongst the working people is something that needs to be given a more kind of coherent articulation than it gets from, certainly from the left, but also from people like Trump or Sanders or Mamdani. I think you can articulate that in a much more coherent and kind of pointed way. And I think that could get traction, and I think a good place to look for an example of that is the Party of Deb, the Socialist Party of Debs. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at there, is that like there is this kind of well of oppositional energy in the body politic that is kind of rooted in the discontents of working class people in capitalist society, that is lacking a really any kind of coherent articulation. And so I'm not saying that like I or anyone else can just go out there and provide that, but what needs to be done in my mind is people need to be like putting ideas out there that might be able to get traction, and kind of discuss those ideas and develop them and debate them and argue about them, and kind of there needs to be like a vibrant kind of culture of kind of entertaining these ideas amongst left-wing people in the public that is simply not there. And what we actually have on the left instead is something that is deeply alienating to a lot of those people, at least when it takes expressions not so much like, say, a Mamdani or a Sanders, but like your more kind of hardened leftists. So anyway, that's kind of what I was getting at with that sort of mission statement. And but it's not so much like I have this idea and it's the idea I think other people should agree with. I do think I have, I think I have a good idea that's worth considering, but I'm more interested in kind of having the conversation about this idea than I am in like, let's start an organization to do
Right.
this. You know what I mean? I think if the idea is worth actually like pursuing, then the organization will come.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
So,
to summarize, this podcast is an organ for promoting these ideas, like similar to what Jacobin did or is doing, similar to what Marx and Engels were doing
mhm,
post
mhm.
1848,
Yeah.
in the era of defeat
Hmm.
and retreat,
Yeah.
which is kind of what we're in now. I mean, it's a long dead actually era that the left is in right now, but we're going to bring the historical perspective of classical Marxism to the current trends and debates of the
Mhm.
left.
And discussing, promoting, but also kind of discussing and hashing out and debating. I think there's an allergy to really discussing ideas on the left. I think it's much more about these kinds of moralistic condemnations than it is about kind of an open discussion of, what may be true, what may be worth pursuing, and I think contributing to like more of a kind of a culture of kind of um, honest intellectual engagement with these ideas. You know, I think that needs to be done. I think there's been way too much of this attitude of like, ironically, there's been a kind of an allergy to intellectualism
Mm.
that's motivated by this kind of hyper intellectualism of like, we have the correct theory of everything and you need to agree with it. And for that reason, we can't discuss anything. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of a catch 22, but,
Well, yeah, you mentioned the word engagements. That's basically, if you were to summarize what the kinds of things you're going to see on this channel, it's going to be engagements with texts, with content, with videos. We're going to, find find videos, find things, find pieces in the news, current events, current trends, engage with them, engage with other people who represent some of these things. Hopefully
mhm,
we'll have debates and interviews on this
yeah.
channel, or on this channel we already have that, but in this podcast, we might engage with history. We'll definitely going to do a little series on I think the history of the SPA, Socialist Party of America, because I think it's going to be important to understand that. I mean, I would, Reed knows a lot about it. I would love to know a lot more about the SPA. This is not something we learned in our school of Trotskyism very much of, just bits and pieces.
Yeah,
Um,
I was just listening to something earlier with where it was actually on Sublation. It was the discussion between Chris Catrone and Caleb Maupin.
yeah,
And Caleb
he banned
Maupin.
me, by the way, or
Oh,
blocked
did
me, I
he?
should say, long time
Uh,
ago. Spanky
well,
tanky.
it was an interesting discussion, but one thing that came up was, because Chris Catrone had been saying how he kind of looks to the history of the Socialist Party of America and the Second International more generally as kind of a point of departure, as opposed to, where a lot of people will look to the 30s, and like Maupin was looking to the 30s and the Popular Front era
Yep.
as kind of his example. And and so Chris raises the Socialist Party of America, and Maupin is basically dismissive of it, saying, or he said he's kind of saying, I had always thought to like kind of dismiss it as this kind of big tent organization that didn't have like a coherent like political perspective or something like that, which is a common, I think, misapprehension. I mean, not that it wasn't a kind of a big tent in a certain way, but it was a serious Marxist political party, and part of the problem is what we even mean by a Marxist political party kind of has changed over it changed over the period from the kind of Debs era to the 30s and after. But that's a whole big can of worms to engage with. So I only bring that up because I think there's a general tendency to just kind of dismiss that chapter of history as not worth taking seriously. And I think that's like deadly in a way, because even if it's not necessarily something to be revived or kind of emulated or something like that, it does at least bear learning from, negatively, if not positively, and I don't think you really learn anything if you just kind of dismiss it out of hand, but it has a lot to, I my perspective is that you can't really understand the history of what comes after that period, after like the 19 teens,
Mm,
after 1917, let's say, if you don't understand what was happening in the 50 years before that, and
mhm.
it's not like it's all good. It's not like there weren't problems. There obviously were very significant problems because, that whole epoch of Marxism culminated in a crisis. And the crisis really was never resolved, I would argue. I would say things that just kind of unraveled after that in a significant way. So anyway, I think there's a lot to discuss there, but I only brought that up as an example of the kind of thing that, like, as you were saying, Eamon, this is something that you don't know as much about as you would like to. And
Mhm.
I think I hope there's people like that, more people like that out there, but I would like to help interest people in that period of Marxism and really the deeper history of socialism in the 19th century.
Just to name a couple specific things, I'd like this podcast to cover wokeism and its Heideggerian roots, debunks of kind of popular misapprehensions
Mhm.
about Marxism, or just claims that are made that are just falsehoods. We could talk about progressivism and whether like social democracy is a step on the way to socialism. I'd love to talk about the rise of Nick Fuentes actually at some point, because it's really interesting to me, especially the past like week or so, what he's been promoting this
Yeah,
like
I've
left
noticed some
right,
of that. Yeah.
this left
Mhm.
right, economically left and right cultural. Like this is the scary thing. The rightists were the first to come to this. There's potential there. The left doesn't have any of that energy, but
Right.
Fuentes is bringing that. We can talk about fascism and whether Trumpism represents fascism with this ICE stuff, and bombing boats with no due process in Venezuela, and all the other things we can say about Trump in this term.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
yeah, fun topics. Hopefully, bring on people to talk with, chat about these ideas, engage with other popular things on the left, like psychoanalysis, maybe MMT, like intersectionality, postmodernism, blah 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 blah
Mhm.
blah. It'll all come up.
Cool. Look forward to I look forward to discussing all of that kind of stuff, should be
Okay,
fun.
well, that is episode 1 in the books. This is the new hope for the reemergence of a left. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. And but this is going to be, we're going to try to make this either weekly or semi-weekly, something like that, ideally. Who knows? We might get excited and more will happen, but that's the plan.